Months learning to fly, developing instincts that kept them alive in combat, building confidence in their own judgment. Now they were being told that all of that was irrelevant the moment they entered the landing pattern. Now they were being told to watch a man with paddles and do exactly what he said, even when every fiber of their being screamed that he was wrong. The pilots who could not make this mental transition died at higher rates than those who could. The statistics were unambiguous. Trust the paddles, live. Fight the paddles, die. Robert Callahan learns this lesson the hard way on his fourth carrier landing. The approach feels good. The Wildcat is stable, the lineup looks correct. The rate of descent seems appropriate. Callahan has 3 combat missions under his belt now, 3 confirmed kills, the beginnings of a reputation as a skilled aviator. He knows what he is doing. Both paddles raised above the horizontal, indicating that he is above the proper glide slope. Callahan disagrees. From his perspective in the cockpit, the approach feels perfect. The deck looks right. The altitude seems correct. The LSO must be wrong. He maintains his glide slope. The LSO signals again, more emphatically. High. You are high. Descend now. Callahan hesitates. His instruments, his eyes, his instincts all tell him that his approach is correct. The man with the paddles is telling him something different. For 2 heartbeats, he wavers between trusting himself and trusting the system. He chooses himself. The Wildcat floats over the deck, too high to catch any of the arresting wires. Callahan sees the barrier rushing toward him, the steel cable rigged across the deck to stop aircraft that miss the wires. He is going to hit it at 50 knots, and the barrier is going to tear his landing gear off and flip his aircraft onto its back. And he is going to die in a ball of fire because he thought he knew better than the paddles. At the last possible moment, he jams the throttle forward. The engine roars. The Wildcat staggers into the air, clearing the barrier by what feels like inches, climbing away for another attempt. The wave off, the ultimate admission that an approach has failed. Callahan circles the pattern, his hands shaking, his mouth dry, replaying the sequence in his mind. The LSO was right. From the platform, with a clear view of the entire approach, the LSO could see what Callahan could not, that the Wildcat was above the glide slope, that it was going to float over the wires, that death was waiting at the end of that trajectory. Callahan could not see it because he was inside the problem. The LSO could see it because he was outside the problem. On his second approach, Callahan follows the paddles exactly. Every signal obeyed instantly. High, he descends. Fast, he reduces power. Left, he corrects. Cut, he chops the throttle without a moment's hesitation. The landing is perfect. The hook catches the second wire. The deceleration is violent but controlled. Callahan sits in his cockpit, engine ticking as it cools and feels. Something fundamental shift in his understanding of what it means to be a carrier pilot. Trust the paddles. The LSO platform is one of the most dangerous positions on an aircraft carrier. It juts out from the port side of the flight deck, just forward of the landing area, fully exposed to any aircraft that goes out of control during the approach. The LSO stands there with no protection except a safety net that might or might not catch him if he has to dive off the platform. He watches aircraft weighing 3 to 5 tons hurtle toward him at 70 miles per hour, knowing that any one of them might lose control and turn him into a red smear on the deck. Lieutenant Michael Dougherty accepts this risk twice a day, every day. For 8 months in 1943, he is the senior LSO aboard the USS Bunker Hill, responsible for bringing home every aircraft in the air group. Batting average, the percentage of approaches that result in successful landings is among the highest in the Pacific Fleet. He does this by understanding aircraft the way a horse trainer understands horses. Each type has its own personality, its own quirks, its own ways of misbehaving. The Hellcat approaches differently than the Avenger. The Dauntless handles differently than the Helldiver. The same signals require different timing depending on what aircraft is in the groove. Beyond that, each individual pilot has his own tendencies. Lieutenant Kowalski always flies his approach too fast. Ensign Bradley drifts right on final. Lieutenant Commander Peterson gets impatient and chops power before the cut signal. Doherty knows all of this. He has logged hundreds of hours on the platform, watching each pilot in the air group, learning their habits, adjusting his signals to compensate for their individual failures. When Kowalski is in the groove, Doherty gives the slow signal earlier than he would for other pilots. When Bradley is on final, Doherty anticipates the right drift and signals the correction before it develops. It is an impossible amount of information to process: aircraft type, pilot tendencies, wind conditions, deck motion, approach angle, lineup, airspeed, rate of descent, and Doherty processes it all in real time, translating the chaos into simple paddle movements that even an exhausted, frightened, combat-stressed pilot can understand. Roger, you are doing fine. Keep doing what you are doing. High, you are above the glide slope. Descend. Low, you are below the glide slope. Climb fast, you are approaching too quickly. Reduce power. Slow, you are approaching too slowly. Add power. Right? You are drifting right. Correct left. Left, you are drifting left. Correct right. Cut. Chop your throttle now. Do not hesitate. Do not think. Cut. Wave off. Your approach is unsalvageable. Add full power and go around. These signals are not suggestions. They are commands. Absolute, unquestionable commands. The pilot who hesitates, who interprets, who decides to wait and see, is the pilot who dies. Doherty has watched men die because they hesitated. He has written the accident reports, attended the memorial services, trained the replacement pilots who arrived to fill the empty bunks. He has learned, through bitter experience, that hesitation kills faster than any Japanese fighter. The irony is not lost on him. In combat, the best pilots are the ones who think quickly, who assess situations and make independent decisions. In the landing pattern, the best pilots are the ones who stop thinking entirely. The war demands both. The carrier pilot must be a killer over the target and a robot over the deck. He must shift between these modes in the time it takes to enter the landing pattern. Few men are naturally capable of this shift. Most must be trained, conditioned, broken of their independent instincts through repetition and punishment. They must learn, through experience that often costs lives, that the paddles are always right, even when they seem wrong. The night landing is the ultimate test. Darkness turns the already terrifying process of carrier landing into something approaching impossibility. The pilot cannot see the deck. He cannot see the ship. He can barely see the horizon. His instruments give him basic information about altitude and airspeed, but they cannot tell him where he is in relation to the small rectangle of steel that represents life instead of death. All he can see are the lights. The carrier shows minimal illumination during night operations, just enough for the LSO to do his job, not enough to turn the ship into a target for enemy submarines. Two vertical rows of lights define the landing area. A horizontal bar of lights marks the stern. And in the darkness, to port the faint glow of the LSO's wands illuminated paddles that replace the canvas versions used during daylight. The pilot flies the approach by watching the wands, nothing else. No instruments, no visible references, no sense of where the deck is or how fast it is moving. Just the glowing wands moving in the darkness, communicating commands that the pilot must obey instantly. High, the wands rise above the horizontal. Low, the wands drop below. Cut the wands / horizontally, the signal to kill the engine and drop onto a deck the pilot cannot see. The act of faith required is almost beyond comprehension. The pilot must chop his throttle, surrender all control, and fall into blackness, trusting that the deck will be there to catch him. He cannot see the arresting wires. He cannot see the barriers. He cannot see anything except the momentary flash of the deck lights to someone better positioned to make them. It was, in a sense, the opposite of what military culture typically demands. Pilots were trained to be decisive, independent, confident. The LSO system asked them to be obedient, trusting, humble. It asked them to accept that someone else knew better, that their own judgment was not to be trusted, that survival depended on submission. Many pilots struggled with this. The ones who struggled too long died. Robert Callahan finishes his combat tour in October 1944, having completed 47 carrier landings without a single accident after his near disaster on the 4th. T.S. Become a true believer in the paddle system, a pilot who follows the LSO's signals with the same unhesitating obedience he brings to instrument flying. He is assigned to training duty afterward, teaching new pilots how to land on carriers. He stands on the LSO platform now, paddles in hand, watching young men make the same mistakes he once made. He sees the hesitation. He sees the pilots fighting the signals, trusting their own judgment, ignoring commands that seem wrong to them. He waves them off again and again until they learn the fundamental lesson. Trust the paddles. Always trust. The paddles, some of them learn quickly. Some of them learn slowly. Some of them never learn at all, and those are the ones who wash out or die. There is no middle ground in carrier aviation. You obey the paddles, or you become a statistic. Callahan writes letters to the families of the ones who die in training. He explains, as gently as he can, that their sons made a mistake, that they hesitated at the wrong moment, that the system could have saved them if they had trusted it. He does not explain how arbitrary it seems, how cruel that a moment's doubt can cost a young man his life. The paddles are always right. That is the fundamental truth of carrier aviation. Even when they seem wrong, they are right. Even when every instinct screams otherwise, they are right. The pilot who accepts this truth will live. The pilot who fights it will die. It is not fair. It is not gentle. It is not the kind of lesson that war movies depict, where courage and skill triumph over adversity. It is a lesson about submission, about humility, about accepting that you are not the hero of your own story in those final 15 seconds. The hero is the man with the paddles. The hero is the landing signal officer, standing on his exposed platform, reading the approach, sending the signals, making the decisions that determine who lives and who dies. The pilot is just the instrument of those decisions. Some men never accept this. They believe, until the moment of their deaths, that they know better than the paddles. They fight the system instead of joining it. They die wondering why the carrier deck rose up to meet them when everything felt so right. The others survive. They go home to their families, build careers, live long lives made possible by a stupid piece of canvas on a stick and a man who knew how to wave it. The unusual landing method that helped Navy pilots survive aircraft carriers was never glamorous. It never made the newsreels. It never produced heroes that the public could recognize and celebrate. But it saved more lives than any weapon system, any tactical innovation, any feat of engineering that the war produced. A man with paddles. A pilot willing to obey. A moment of trust in the chaos of combat. That was enough. That was everything. The deck of the USS Enterprise in the spring of 1945 is a different place than it was in the spring of 1942. The craft are faster, heavier, more capable. The pilots are better trained, more experienced, more confident. But the LSO still stands on his platform, paddles in hand, watching each approach with the same intensity that his predecessors brought to the job. The signals are the same. The obedience is the same. The fundamental bargain, trust me and live, remains unchanged. The war ends in August. The carriers sail home. The pilots return to a country that cannot truly understand what they have been through, what they have learned about trust and submission, and the limits of individual judgment. They scatter across America, building lives, raising families, growing old. They tell stories about combat, about Japanese fighters and flaming oil and the chaos of battle. They rarely tell stories about landing on carriers. Some things are too visceral, too personal, too difficult to explain to people who have never felt the deck rushing up beneath them while a man with paddles controlled their fate. But when former carrier pilots gather, when they meet at reunions or chance encounters, they share a secret understanding. They know what it means to surrender control. They know what it costs to trust another human being with your life. They know that the bravest thing they ever did was not fight the enemy, but obey the paddles when every instinct screamed to do otherwise. The unusual landing methods saved them. All of them. Every one of them who lived long enough to grow old owes that longevity to a system that seemed absurd, that demanded what seemed impossible. That worked because human beings are capable of things they do not believe they are capable of. Trust, in the end, is what separated the living from the dead. Trust in a man they barely knew, standing in a position of mortal danger. Communicating through the simplest possible signals. Trust that seemed stupid until it saved their lives. The paddles were always right. Even now, decades after the last wartime carrier landing, the survivors still remember. They remember the cut signal, the moment of falling, the crash of contact that meant life instead of death. They remember trusting the paddles. And they remember, with a clarity that time cannot dim, that the unusual landing method was never really about the paddles at all. It was about learning to let go. The Wildcat is too high, too fast, and the deck is rushing up at an angle that means death. Ensign Robert Callahan sees the stern of the USS Hornet filling his windscreen. Sees the tiny figures of deck crew scrambling for cover. Sees the arresting wires that he is about to miss entirely. His hand moves to the throttle, instinct screaming at him to add power to go around to abort this impossible approach. But there is a man standing at the edge of the deck with two yellow paddles, and that man is telling him to cut his engine. Right now, without question, without hesitation. Callahan has 0.3 of a second to decide whether to trust his own judgment or trust a stranger waving colored fabric on sticks. He cuts the throttle. The Wildcat drops like a stone. The impact slams Callahan forward against his harness, compresses his spine, blurs his vision. The tailhook catches the third wire, catches it by perhaps 6 inches of margin, and the deceleration throws him forward again as 3 tons. Of aircraft goes from 70 knots to 0 in less than 2 seconds. He is alive. He should not be alive. Everything about that approach was wrong. And he is sitting on a carrier deck instead of burning in the Pacific because a man with paddles told him what to do, and he obeyed. Welcome to the most unusual landing system ever devised for military aviation. A system so counterintuitive, so dependent on human judgment rather than instruments, that pilots initially refused to believe it could work. A system that asked men to surrender control of their aircraft at the most critical moment of flight, to place their lives entirely in the hands of another human being standing in one of the most dangerous positions on the ship. The landing signal officer. The man with the paddles. The reason carrier aviation became survivable instead of suicidal. This is the story of how a seemingly absurd idea having pilots obey hand signals from a man waving colored sticks saved more Navy aviators than any technological innovation in the history of carrier warfare. The problem was obvious from the moment the first aircraft attempted to land on a ship. The deck was too short. The approach was too fast. The pilot could not see where he was going. A carrier deck in 1942 measured approximately 800 feet from bow to stern, but only a fraction of that length was usable for landing. Aircraft parked forward, the island superstructure to starboard, barriers rigged amidships the actual landing area was perhaps 400 feet of pitching, rolling, heaving steel surrounded by a 60-foot drop to cold ocean. The aircraft themselves were not designed for this abuse. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the Navy's frontline fighter at the start of the Pacific War, had a landing speed of approximately 70 knots. Its forward visibility was poor. The radial engine created a massive blind spot directly ahead of the pilot. Its landing gear was designed for runways, not for the controlled crashes that carrier landings actually were, and the carrier itself was never still. Even in calm seas, a ship the size of the Hornet or Enterprise pitched and rolled enough to turn a stable approach into a death sentence. In rough weather, the deck could rise and fall 20 feet between the moment a pilot began his approach and the moment he was supposed to touch down. Before the war, the Navy lost more aircraft to landing accidents than to any other cause. Training squadrons watched helplessly as pilot after pilot misjudged the approach, caught a wingtip on the deck, cartwheeled into the island, bounced over the barriers and into the aircraft parked forward, or simply flew into the stern at full speed because they could not see it coming. The instruments were useless. Altimeters could not react fast enough to a pitching deck. Airspeed indicators could not account for the wind across the deck, which varied with the ship's speed and heading. Artificial horizons could not tell a pilot that he was drifting left or settling too fast or about to catch his hook on the round down. Something else was needed, something that could process all of this information in real time and translate it into simple commands that a pilot could follow without thinking. That something turned out to be a human being. Lieutenant Commander John Pearson stands on the LSO platform of the USS Yorktown, watching a Devastator torpedo bomber struggling to establish a proper approach. The aircraft is low and slow, its hook dangling, its pilot clearly exhausted after a 4-hour patrol over empty ocean. The deck is pitching in moderate swells, rising and falling perhaps 10 feet with each wave. Pearson has been doing this job for 2 years. He has talked down hundreds of aircraft, saved dozens of lives, watched men die when they ignored his signals or when his own judgment failed. He knows this particular pilot, a young lieutenant named Morrison, who joined the squadron 3 months ago. Morrison is a good stick, talented in the air, but he has never fully trusted the paddles. He hesitates, he second-guesses. He tries to fly his own approach instead of following the signals. Today, Morrison's hesitation will kill him. Pearson sees the Devastator settling toward the stern, its rate of descent too high. He gives the signal for more power paddles raised, waggling. Morrison adds throttle, but not enough. The aircraft is still sinking. Pearson signals again, more emphatically. Power, power, now. Morrison finally responds, but the response is too late. The Devastator's wheels strike the round out the curved steel at the stern of the flight deck where it meets the fantail. The impact tears off the landing gear. The aircraft slams down on its belly, slides forward in a shower of sparks, and catches a wingtip on the deck edge. The cartwheel is almost graceful in its violence. The Devastator spins twice, shedding pieces of wing and tail, and goes over the side in a cascade of burning fuel. Pearson watches the splash, watches the flames on the water, watches the empty space where Morrison used to be. The destroyer escort behind them moves to search for survivors. There will not be any. Pearson marks the time in his log, records the details of the accident, and prepares for the next aircraft in the pattern. There are 11 more planes waiting to land. The war does not pause for grief. That night, in his tiny cabin, Pearson writes a letter to Morrison's widow. He has written to many of these letters. He will write more. But this one is different, because this one did not have to happen. Morrison died because he did not trust the paddles. He died because he thought he knew better than the man whose entire job was to know better. He died because the system, brilliant as it was, required something that went against every instinct a pilot possessed: complete surrender of control. The landing signal officer system evolved through trial and catastrophic error in the years before Pearl Harbor. The early attempts were crewed a man on deck, waving his arms, trying to communicate through gesture what the pilot needed to do. The signals were not standardized. Different LSOs used different methods. Pilots trained at one base could not understand the signals at another. The crashes continued. Men died by the dozens, their aircraft crumpled on flight decks or swallowed by the sea. The Navy studied each accident, cataloged each failure, searched for patterns that might reveal a solution. What they discovered was counterintuitive. The best landing results came not from giving pilots more information, but from giving them less. Not from better instruments, but from simpler commands. Not from trusting individual judgment, but from eliminating individual judgment entirely. The standardized LSO system emerged from this realization. Every Navy LSO would use the same signals. Every Navy pilot would be trained to obey those signals without question. The exchange of information would be reduced to its absolute minimum: too high, too low, too fast, too slow, lined up, drifting, cut, wave off. No negotiation, no interpretation, no thinking. The pilot's job was to follow the paddles. The LSO's job was to be the pilot's eyes, brain, and judgment during the final 15 seconds of approach. The system worked only if both parties accepted their roles completely. It was a radical redistribution of authority. Pilots were trained to be decisive, independent, confident in their own abilities. The LSO system asked them to become something else entirely during the landing phase: obedient, trusting, willing to accept that another person understood their situation better than they did. Many pilots resisted. They had spent. As he slams down and feels the hook catch. Night-qualified carrier pilots are a special breed. They have learned to trust the wands absolutely, to surrender their natural fear of darkness and falling, to accept that the LSO can see what they cannot. Many pilots never achieve this level of trust. They wash out of night qualification, transferred to land-based squadrons, or assigned to permanent daylight operations. There is no shame in this. Not everyone is capable of the psychological surrender that night carrier landing requires. But those who can do it become invaluable. Night-qualified pilots can launch strikes in darkness, attack enemy ships that believe themselves safe, return to their carriers without waiting for dawn. They extend the carrier's operational reach from 12 hours a day to 24. The LSOs who guide them carry even heavier burdens. One mistake, one misjudged signal, and a pilot who has placed complete trust in the wands will fly into the deck or the water. The LSO must be perfect, every time. In darkness, in fatigue, in the stress of combat operations that leave no margin for error. Lieutenant James Hendricks serves as night LSO aboard the USS Enterprise during the Marianas Campaign of June 1944. In a single week, he guides 147 aircraft through night landings without a single accident. His arms ache from holding the wands. His eyes burn from staring into darkness. His voice is hoarse from calling out information to his assistant, who logs each approach. On the 8th night, his luck runs out. The Hellcat comes in low and fast, its pilot clearly struggling with the approach. Hendricks signals slow, then high, then slow again, watching the aircraft weave through corrections that never quite stabilize. He should wave it off. His instincts are screaming at him to wave it off. But the pilot is low on fuel. The radio chatter confirms it barely enough for one more approach. A wave-off means a water landing, a man in the darkness, rescue operations that may or may not succeed. Hendricks keeps working the approach, trying to salvage something that should not be salvaged. He signals corrections faster, more emphatically, trying to communicate the urgency through the movement of his wands. The Hellcat is almost in the groove now. Almost stable, almost landable. Hendricks gives the cut. The aircraft drops. For one eternal second, Hendricks believes it will work, believes the hook will catch. The deceleration will save the pilot. The impossible approach will somehow become a successful landing. The hook bounces. The Hellcat hits the deck, skips over. All 3 wires slams into the barrier at 40 knots. The barrier catches the aircraft's propeller, snaps it off, sends the engine tearing free of its mounts. The fuselage cartwheels. Fuel sprays across the deck. Fire erupts. The pilot is dead before the crash crew can reach him. The fire burns for 11 minutes. The deck is closed for 2 hours while the wreckage is cleared. Hendricks stands on the LSO platform through all of it, watching the flames, replaying the approach in his mind. He should have waved it off. He knew he should have waved it off. But he tried to save a pilot who was almost out of fuel, and instead he killed him. The arithmetic is brutal. A wave-off might have killed the pilot in a water landing. Continuing the approach definitely killed him on the deck. Hendricks made the wrong choice, and a man is dead. He will make the same choice again in similar circumstances, because that is the job. The LSO must decide, in fractions of seconds, whether an approach can be salvaged or must be abandoned. He must accept that some of his decisions will be wrong, that men will die because of his judgment that perfection is impossible even though the job demands it. Hendricks guides the next aircraft to a safe landing 20 minutes after the fire is extinguished. Then the next, and the next, and the next. And the next, the squadron must continue operating. The war does not pause for grief. He writes his incident report that night, his hands steady on the typewriter keys. He describes the approach, the signals, the decision to continue, the crash. He does not describe the screaming he heard as the pilot burned or the smell that lingered on the deck for hours afterward, or the way his hands shook when no one was watching. Some things do not belong in official reports. The statistics tell one version of the story. During World War II, U.S. Navy lost approximately 12,000 aircraft in non-combat operations training accidents, mechanical failures, and landing mishaps. A significant percentage of these losses occurred during carrier landings. But the statistics also tell another story. By 1945, the carrier landing accident rate had dropped to a fraction of what it was in 1941. Pilots who would have died in the early months of the war survived because the LSO system had been perfected, because standardized signals had eliminated confusion, because a culture of absolute obedience to the paddles had been drilled into every naval aviator. The unusual landing method worked. It worked because it recognized a fundamental truth about human performance under stress. A pilot in the final seconds of a carrier approach is not capable of processing complex information. His cognitive capacity is overwhelmed by fear, fatigue, sensory overload, and the physical demands of flying. He cannot simultaneously manage his aircraft and judge his approach and calculate corrections and assess risk. The LSO system removed the judgment and calculation from the pilot's task. It left him with only 2 responsibilities: fly the aircraft and obey the signals. Everything else, the assessment, the risk calculation, the decision-making, was delegated to a trained specialist standing in a position where he could actually see what was happening. This delegation of authority was the key innovation, not the paddles themselves, not the standardized signals, not the platform or the wands or any other piece of equipment. The breakthrough was conceptual, recognizing that the pilot was the wrong person to be making landing decisions, and creating a system that moved those decisions.